Imagine a woman's jaw being deliberately reconstructed while she remains alive. Not shattered, not broken, surgically altered. The bone cut at precise angles, rewired with bronze so that when she tries to scream, when she needs to scream, her own body betrays her. The sound that emerges is something between a growl and child's cry. Something not quite human. Something designed never to be human again. This wasn't punishment for murder. This wasn't retribution for treason. This was what happened to women who existed in the wrong family, at the wrong time, in the wrong century. Welcome to Quiet Historians. I'm your host. And if you enjoy stories of how power corrupts the very definition of suffering itself, if you need to understand the depths humans will descend to maintain control, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious what drives people to follow these narratives into the darkness. Because these aren't stories for comfort. They're testimonies that demand to be heard. Between 911 and 609 BCE, something philosophically catastrophic happened in the heart of Mesopotamia. An empire didn't just conquer territory, it didn't just demand tributes or enslave populations. The Neo-Assyrian Empire systematized the manufacture of terror into something approaching religious doctrine. And nowhere was this more precisely engineered than in how they handled women. Not all women. Women of consequence, princesses, queens, daughters of rival kings, women whose existence proved that other bloodlines had legitimacy, women whose names appeared on treaties. These women represented a problem to Assyrian philosophy. They were symbols, breathing symbols of potential uprising, of alternative power structures that could theoretically rally populations. The solution wasn't to execute them quickly. That would be too merciful, too conventional, too likely to transform them into martyrs. What the Assyrians discovered, and what they systematically documented, was that terror, true terror, isn't about death. Death ends things. Death provides closure. Terror is the opposite. It stretches endlessly forward. The clay tablets that survived in the palace archives of Kalhu tell us something that academic historians have spent decades carefully translating, not because the translation was difficult, but because the content defied comfortable categorization. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. This was administration, methodology, policy. Consider the case of Eleni, documented in the annals found in 1843 by Claudius Rich, and later analysed by scholars like Kirk Grayson and Simo Parpola. She was born into the royal house of Elam, a neighbouring empire that occasionally challenged Assyrian authority. When her father's revolt failed, she was surrendered as part of the peace settlement, not as a slave in the conventional sense, but as a living document of what happened when you opposed Assyria. Her initial punishment reads almost casually in translation: removal of her status markers. But this was calculated erasure. In Mesopotamian culture, certain women wore specific jewellery indicating their rank. Their hair was arranged in particular styles. They wore certain colours and fabrics. Over the course of 3 months, Eleni was systematically stripped of these external markers of identity, not roughly, delicately. Her jewels were removed one at a time by priests while they recited prayers to Ishtar asking for her continued health. They needed her healthy. They always needed them healthy. Her hair was shorn not once but weekly, by the same barber, in a ritual that became routine. The psychological weight of routine is something historians rarely discuss. If something happens once, it's trauma. If it happens weekly, it becomes a law of nature. Her mind would have eventually accepted it. That acceptance itself was a form of victory for her captors, the victory of habit over resistance. But the physical alteration came next. And this is where we enter territory that separates Assyrian methodology from other ancient brutalities. Eleni's face was reassembled. The bridge of her nose was deliberately fractured, then set incorrectly so that it healed at an angle that made her unrecognizable even to people who had known her before. This wasn't crude violence. Surgeons did this. Medical professionals employed by the palace. The breaks were clean. The healing was monitored. Medications were applied to prevent infection. She had to survive this process. She had to survive it completely healthy. After the bone healed, the real work began. The skin around her eyes was tattooed with symbols, not beautifying patterns, but administrative markers, symbols that identified her as someone who had attempted to resist, who had belonged to a fallen house. The ink was made from a mixture of plant ash and minerals that turned black and would never fade. Every time Eleni saw her own reflection, she was reading her biography written into her own flesh. But she was kept alive, fed well, bathed, given medical attention when infections threatened, because the moment of her creation, the moment she transformed from a princess into a living warning, required that she survive long enough to be seen, long enough to become a known quantity in the palace. She was given rooms adjacent to the throne room, not as accommodation, as exhibition. Ambassadors from other nations would be escorted past her chambers specifically to see her, to witness what happened to women who carried the blood of empire rivals. No words were needed. The image itself was the message. This is what historian Mario Liverani calls the weaponization of the body, not as an instrument of war, but as an instrument of diplomacy. Every scar, every healed fracture, every permanent alteration was a paragraph in a larger text, written to foreign courts. This is what rebellion looks like. This is what it produces. Choose carefully. The sophistication of Assyrian punishment extended beyond the merely physical into psychological territories that modern terminology struggles to name. The concept they used was one that appeared repeatedly in palace records, a phrase that translates approximately as unbeing, the process of stripping a person of every element that made them recognizable as having existed. In 642 BCE, when King Ashurbanipal conquered Susa, the capital of Elam, he didn't just seize wealth or strategic resources. He captured the entire royal family, including 4 daughters of King Tumen. These women had never been soldiers. They had never made political decisions. Their only crime was existing as symbols of Elamite legitimacy. What happened next was so extensively documented, in reliefs, in written accounts, in the personal correspondence of palace administrators, that we can reconstruct not just what occurred, but how the Assyrians thought about it as they did it. The 4 daughters were given new names immediately upon capture, not names that mocked them or insulted them, names that meant nothing, administratively neutral designations. In doing this, the Assyrians understood something that modern psychology would take millennia to articulate. Identity isn't just social, it's linguistic. The moment your own name stops being used, a part of your consciousness begins to fragment. You're still you, but the world is no longer arranged around confirming that you are you. They were housed separately in different sections of the palace. This wasn't done for security reasons. They were women, largely unarmed, in the heart of enemy territory. They were separated to prevent conversation, to eliminate the possibility that they might maintain their collective identity through shared language and memory. If one sister could no longer confirm to the others that they were sisters, the bonds began to attenuate. Their physical appearance was then subjected to what the palace records call the reconfiguration of form. Specialists were brought in: surgeons, tattoo artists, craftspeople who normally worked on royal monuments and artwork. For 6 months, the daughters of Tumen underwent a process of being visually unmade. Their hair was removed entirely and prevented from growing back through regular applications of a caustic salve that scarred the scalp. In Mesopotamian culture, hair on a woman was not decoration. It was an identifying feature. A woman could be recognized by her hair from a distance. These women would never be recognizable in that way again. The skin of their shoulders was tattooed with imagery that marked them as slaves, not just visually, but symbolically. The patterns used were the same patterns used on livestock, on property. The message was unambiguous. You have been recategorized. You're no longer the kind of being you were before. Their feet were bound in a process borrowed from other cultures, but refined for Assyrian purposes. The binding didn't cripple them. They could still walk, but it changed how they moved. It introduced pain into every step. Chronic, low-level pain that never resolved. Pain became the baseline condition. Any moment without pain would start to feel like an absence rather than a natural state, and they were displayed, regularly, in the public spaces of the palace, not as curiosities, as evidence. The reliefs that survive in museums today, fragments of palace walls that archaeologists excavated in the 19th century, show these women standing, and the sculptures capture something that the written records don't quite manage. The absolute stillness of people who have learned that movement draws attention. That attention brings pain. Their expressions carved in stone are blank, not peaceful, blank. The absence of expression as a survival strategy. But perhaps the most systematically cruel innovation of Assyrian practice was something that the palace records call the 1,000-day dissolution. This was a formalized process applied to women who had committed what Assyrians considered the greatest crime. They had maintained loyalty to a fallen family rather than accepting Assyrian authority as final and absolute. The process began with public statement. The woman would be brought to the central square of whatever city had been chosen as her place of punishment, usually a city close to her homeland, where news of what happened would travel fastest. She would be displayed without clothing, not for sexual violation, but for the complete erasure of dignity. Her titles would be read aloud by scribes and then deliberately erased from official records stone by stone as crowds watched. Then came the sustained portion. For exactly 1,000 days, the specificity is documented in multiple sources, the woman would be given 3 tasks that rotated daily. One day, she would be forced to clean the latrines of the palace, crawling into spaces beneath the floors where human waste accumulated. She was given a wooden scraper. She was given rags. She was given nothing else. The smell alone, extended over hours, would have been a form of torture. Another day, she would be sent to the tanning yards where animal hides were processed. She would work the vats filled with caustic urine and lime. Her hands would bleed. The caustic would enter through the wounds. Her fingernails would eventually fall away. She would continue working with her bleeding hands because stopping meant worse consequences. Another day, she would be required to tend fields as a labourer, not planting, not harvesting, but spreading the human waste from the latrines as fertiliser. She would do this in view of other people. She would do this while wearing clothes that had been dyed with cheap dyes that looked almost like the expensive purple she might have worn before. The resemblance was deliberate. Everyone looking at her was meant to understand. This is what used to be royalty. The documentation gets more specific than this. There are records of what she was fed: barley bread, sometimes mixed with chaff so she couldn't swallow without pain, water drawn from troughs also used by animals. Occasionally, salt added to her food to maintain chronic low-level dehydration, enough that she wouldn't die of thirst, but enough that she lived in a state of constant discomfort, constant craving. Medical attention was provided to ensure she survived. If infection threatened, antibiotics derived from plant sources were applied. If she became pregnant, and some did, she was given herbs to terminate the pregnancy, then return to her duties. The goal wasn't just punishment for her. The goal was punishment that could be extended indefinitely. Her body had to remain a functional vehicle for suffering. And then came the 1,001st day. She was released, not freed. Released, like a tool no longer needed. She was given back her name officially, though no one recognized it anymore. She was given documents confirming her former status, though these documents were now worthless. She was given provisions for a month, and she was sent out. The palace records don't dwell on what happened next, but Babylonian accounts from later periods, written by people recording second-hand information from refugees, describe what occurred. No city would accept her. No family would acknowledge her. She carried a smell that hadn't left her body. Her appearance had been fundamentally altered by the 1,000 days. Her hands no longer looked quite like human hands. Her skin had discolorations from the caustic materials that would never fully fade. Some of these women ended up in the wilderness. Some were taken by bandits who saw them as compromised, less than human, available for exploitation without consequence. Some somehow formed communities with other survivors, enclaves of women that had been systematically unmade by empire and were learning how to exist in that unmaking. The psychological dimension of this practice is what distinguishes it from simpler cruelty. She had been punished. She had survived the punishment, and the world itself had been reconfigured so that her survival was irrelevant. She had been made a ghost while still alive, a ghost with a body that still required food, still experienced pain, still carried memories that no one would listen to. What makes the Assyrian approach fundamentally different from other ancient empires' methods of control is something historians often note but rarely emphasize sufficiently. The Assyrians kept records, meticulous, detailed records. They didn't just inflict these punishments. They documented them. They created an archive. They wanted future generations, or at least future Assyrian governors, to understand the exact procedures, the exact timeline, the exact psychological mechanisms that made these practices effective. The palace archives found at Nineveh and Kalhu contain thousands of clay tablets. Most discuss administration, taxation, military campaigns. But scattered throughout are these other records, personal correspondences between the king and his physicians, notes about a woman's health status, documentation of when to increase punishment and when to ease off to maintain the optimal level of physical deterioration without actual death. One tablet from the reign of Sargon II describes in clinical language the reconstruction of a captive's face following an intentional fracture. The description isn't cruel, it's professional. It notes that the fracture should be set in a way that looks like it healed incorrectly naturally, so that the woman herself might not fully understand that it had been engineered. The ambiguity about whether her suffering was purposeful or accidental would add a psychological dimension. Had she done something to deserve this, or had she simply been unlucky? The uncertainty itself becomes punishment. This documentation serves a purpose beyond mere record-keeping. In a military empire, institutional knowledge matters. If a king dies and a new one takes power, new governors move into regions, that knowledge can dissipate. By writing these procedures down, by storing them in the palace archive, the Assyrians were essentially creating a manual, a how-to guide for managing conquered populations through fear that targets the mind more than the body. And the content of these archives made an impact on how surrounding empires behaved. When Babylon later came to dominate Mesopotamia and eventually absorbed Assyrian territory, Babylonian rulers studied these methods. They didn't copy them exactly, but the principles, the idea that punishment could be extended, psychological, designed to produce a living warning, these principles spread. They infected later imperial practices. The Roman Empire would develop its own variations. The Persians would adapt these ideas into their own system of psychological control. In this way, Assyrian methodologies outlived the Assyrian Empire itself by centuries. Ideas don't die with civilizations. They mutate, they spread, they become normalized. Yet there is another story that the Assyrian archives don't fully capture, though hints of it survive in fragments and in archaeological discoveries made as recently as the 1990s. This is the story of what some of these women did with their suffering. In 612 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed. Nineveh, the great capital, was sacked by Medes and Babylonians. The palaces were systematically destroyed. Soldiers rushed through the rooms looking for treasure. They smashed statues, threw tablets into rubble, set fires that consumed decades of accumulated records. In the chaos, the women who had been held in the palace, those who were still alive, simply left. Some escaped in the darkness. Some were released by soldiers who either pitied them or saw no value in killing them. What archaeologists found over a century later, as they were excavating the ruins and cataloguing the fragments, was unexpected. Scattered throughout the palace rubble, usually in crevices or hidden beneath fallen stones, were small clay tablets. Not official documents, not records meant for archives. These were crude, hasty, clearly written by untrained hands. Some were barely larger than a fingernail. Some were so fragile they crumbled at the slightest touch. And they were written in Aramaic, not the official Akkadian script of the palace, which meant they were written by people who didn't have access to formal scribal training. Written by people who shouldn't have been writing at all. The content, when finally deciphered and studied, was fragmentary but unmistakable. These were testimonies, personal records, reckonings. One tablet, roughly transcribed by the scholar who first examined it in 1924, reads in translation something like, "They call me nobody. My hands are no longer mine. But I was here. I existed. I will leave this mark so that someone, someday, will know." Another, "My sisters were taken into separate rooms. I never saw them again. I called for them until my voice disappeared. They said my voice disappeared because the gods abandoned me. I think the gods abandoned me because they couldn't bear to listen." Another, barely decipherable, "The scars on my back spell out symbols I cannot read. They told me what they mean. I don't believe them. I will decide what they mean." These weren't written with the intention of being found. The women who wrote them had no reason to believe that anyone would ever discover them, much less read them. Some of the tablets may have been written after the palace was destroyed using fragments of clay from the rubble. The writers were creating witnesses to their own existence. They were insisting, in the only way they could, that what had happened to them was real and that it mattered. The historian Stephanie Daly, who has done extensive work on these fragments, argues that these represent some of the earliest documented evidence of testimony as resistance. Not violent resistance, not political resistance, existential resistance, the refusal to disappear completely, the insistence on leaving a mark that proved, I was here and I matter. What's remarkable is how these women subverted the very language of their oppression. The Assyrians had tattooed symbols on their bodies as marks of slavery. In some of the tablets, we see women reframing these scars as battle wounds, badges of survival rather than badges of defeat. The Assyrians had given them names that meant nothing. In the tablets, some of the women had created new names for themselves, names they wrote themselves, names that meant something to them even if no one else would use them. One woman wrote, "They broke my hands, now I write with my broken hands. Let that be a record of what I survived." The power of that single sentence, if we accept the translation, and there's scholarly debate about exact meaning, is that it claims agency over the very instrument of her oppression. She's not broken despite her hands. She's not writing despite her broken hands. She's writing with her broken hands. The breaks are part of the signature, part of the message. They become evidence of something other than defeat. The physical evidence of Assyrian punishment exists in multiple forms, not just in the palace records, but in skeletal remains that modern forensic anthropologists have analysed. In 2003, researchers examining remains from mass graves near Kalhu identified bone fractures consistent with the descriptions in the palace records. Precise, surgical fractures, healed in specific ways. The evidence was there in calcified bone. This had been done deliberately, repeatedly, on multiple individuals. There are also artistic representations in the palace reliefs. Stone carvings that show captive women in various states of alteration. For a long time, art historians interpreted these as simply showing enslaved women. But when examined more closely, with knowledge of what the written records described, it becomes clear that the sculptures are anatomically accurate representations of specific injuries. The artists were creating stone records of specific cases, creating monuments to suffering. One relief shows a woman whose facial structure has clearly been altered. Another shows women whose hair has been completely removed. Another shows women with visible marks on their skin. These weren't idealized sculptures. They were documentation. They were proof. Look at this, the Assyrian court was saying to anyone who saw these walls. This happened. And it can happen again. The existential horror of this isn't just the punishment itself. It's the public acknowledgement of the punishment. It's the empire's willingness to memorialize cruelty, to create permanent records of it, to ensure that everyone knew that this was possible, that there were no hidden executions, no quiet deaths that could be rewritten into something else. Everything was visible, everything was acknowledged, and that visibility itself was part of the punishment. But what fascinates contemporary scholars most is the apparent psychological sophistication of Assyrian methodology. These weren't crude torturers who didn't understand pain. These were administrators and physicians who understood that suffering operates on multiple levels simultaneously. First, there's the physical level. The body's harmed. That's straightforward and direct. But then there's the social level. The woman becomes a visible example. She's displayed so that others can see what happens when you resist, or when you belong to a resisting family. The surveillance itself is punishment. She's always being observed, always knowing she's being observed, and that knowledge changes how she moves through space, how she interacts with others, how she thinks about herself. Then there's the temporal level. She knows that her punishment has an endpoint, 1,000 days, for instance. But she also knows that the endpoint doesn't mean freedom, doesn't mean acceptance, doesn't mean she gets her life back. The knowledge that survival will only produce a different form of suffering is its own psychological torture. And then there's the epistemic level. She's been told that she deserves this, that her family's resistance justified it, that the gods have abandoned her because of her bloodline, that she's no longer fully human. These are stories she's told about herself, and in an environment where there's no contradictory narrative, where everyone around her reinforces these stories, where she has no one to remind her of who she was before, those stories begin to calcify into something like truth. She begins to believe them, and that belief is perhaps the cruelest punishment of all, because it means that even if she escapes, Even if she's physically released, her sense of self has been fundamentally altered by the experience. Modern psychology would call this complex trauma. It would note that recovery from such trauma is not guaranteed, that survivors often experience what's called internalized oppression, the absorption of their oppressor's view of them as true and deserved. But the Assyrians didn't have psychological terminology. They just understood through practice and observation that if you could break someone's sense of who they were, their body would follow. And if you could make them doubt their own existence, even after they were released, they would carry their prison with them forever. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE didn't immediately end these practices. Other empires had learned from the Assyrian model and adapted it. Some of the women who had been held by the Assyrians and then released when the empire fell found themselves later captured by Babylonians, who employed modified versions of the same techniques. Empire learned from empire. Cruelty refined itself through documentation and transmission, but something shifted after the physical destruction of the Assyrian state. When you destroy a capital, when you burn the palaces, when you scatter the administrators and soldiers, the continuity of institutional practice becomes harder to maintain, and more importantly, the authority structure that had made these punishments comprehensible, that had made them seem logical within the framework of imperial power, collapsed. The women who survived and formed small communities outside the destroyed cities, according to fragmentary accounts from later Babylonian historians, eventually began to reconstruct a collective narrative about what had happened to them. They were no longer isolated individuals, each convinced of their own guilt and worthlessness. In community, they could begin to rebuild an alternative story. A story where what had happened to them was not justified. A story where the perpetrators had been defeated. A story where survival meant something other than failure. Some of these women eventually re-entered settled society, though the records suggest they were always somewhat liminal, always somewhat marked as other. They became merchants' wives, became healers, became priestesses in temples devoted to goddesses of healing and resurrection. Their experiences were never erased, but they were integrated into a different framework, a framework where what they had survived made them powerful rather than worthless, where their scars became evidence not of shame but of endurance. This transformation, from victim to survivor to person with agency and authority, isn't documented in the Assyrian records because by the time it would have been most clearly visible, the Assyrian Empire no longer existed to record it. But fragments of evidence suggest it happened. Later Mesopotamian literature includes stories of wise women whose knowledge came from survival of unspeakable treatment. Women whose guidance was sought because they had seen what the empire's systems did to people and had survived it intact enough to think clearly about alternatives. The broader historical question that emerges from studying Assyrian punishment practices is this: why did an empire that was militarily so powerful need to develop such elaborate systems of psychological torture? They had the power to simply kill people. They had the power to execute entire families and move on. But they chose instead to create systems of prolonged suffering. Why? Part of the answer lies in what historians call the legitimacy problem of empires. Empires govern territories that are often full of people who would prefer not to be governed, people who remember alternative systems, people who have reasons to believe that those alternative systems might have been better. How do you maintain control over populations that don't want to be controlled? You can use military force, but military force is expensive and requires constant application. You need soldiers stationed everywhere. You need to train new soldiers constantly to replace those who die or retire. It's resource intensive. Alternatively, you can use fear, but fear wears off. You can execute a few rebels and eventually people stop being scared. The fear becomes historical, becomes something that happened to other people. But what if you could create living reminders? What if you could take a person and transform them into a walking warning? Someone that everyone in the community knows about, has seen, understands what happened to them. That's more efficient. That person only needs to exist to be terrifying. You don't need to execute new rebels constantly. You just need to maintain a few visible examples. And that's what the Assyrians discovered. That systematized horror targeted at specific, visible individuals could terrorize entire populations more effectively than indiscriminate killing. It's a calculation that's depressing in its pragmatism. If the alternative to punishment is death, and death is invisible, then suffering is more efficient than execution. Suffering is cheaper. Suffering teaches lessons faster. But there's another element to this that the records hint at, though it's rarely directly stated. The Assyrians seem to have believed that certain people deserved suffering, not because of what they had done, but because of who they were, because they came from rival families, because they carried bloodlines that represented alternative power structures. The Assyrian logic was something like, you exist as a symbol of something we need to erase. Your existence is inherently political. Therefore, your transformation into a warning is justified. This is fundamentally different from punishing someone for an action they took. This is punishing someone for their identity, for their existence. And it opens a philosophical door that's very dark. If merely existing can be construed as a crime, then there's no action you can take that would make you safe. No choice that would protect you. You're unsafe simply by being. The psychological implications of this for the women who experienced it were catastrophic. Because it means that whatever narrative they created to explain why this happened to them, I must have done something wrong. My family must have deserved this. Those narratives only work if their actions can be corrected. But if their crime is simply existing, if their sin is their bloodline, then there's no corrective action, no way to earn back safety or status. They've been marked as fundamentally unforgivable, not because of what they did, but because of what they are. Some of the women who survived and whose accounts were recorded centuries later reported that they eventually came to understand this distinction. And understanding it was, in some ways, liberating, because it meant that the shame wasn't theirs. It meant that they hadn't caused this through their own failures. It meant that the Assyrian Empire had been unjust, not incidentally, but fundamentally. The empire had targeted them for their existence, had marked them for destruction for simply being who they were born to be. This reframing, from guilt to injustice, seems to have been crucial for many survivors' eventual healing and reintegration. One of the most significant discoveries related to Assyrian punishment practices came not from the palaces themselves, but from a fragmentary archaeological layer at the site of ancient Ashur, the religious capital of the Assyrian Empire. There, mixed in with debris from destroyed temples and administrative buildings, archaeologists found what appeared to be a small shrine. Inside the shrine were dozens of tiny figurines carved from bone and stone. The figurines were crude, not professionally made. They depicted women in various poses, sleeping, kneeling, standing with arms raised. The shrine itself was constructed illegally, in a space where it shouldn't have been. It was hidden, literally covered by later construction, and only discovered when modern excavation revealed the layers beneath. And the figurines, when examined, showed marks that suggested they'd been repeatedly handled over an extended period. The wear patterns indicated they'd been picked up, held, then set back down countless times. The most plausible interpretation, supported by some scholars and disputed by others, is that this was a shrine created by enslaved or captive women, a place where they created representations of themselves or other women, and through repeated handling of these figurines, engaged in a kind of sympathetic magic or spiritual practice aimed at healing, remembrance, or protest. Whether it was meant literally as magic or was more psychological, a way of creating agency and control in a situation where they had neither, the discovery suggests something important. These women weren't passive recipients of suffering. They were creating their own practices, their own meanings, their own ways of asserting dignity in the face of systematic degradation. The shrine was eventually destroyed, buried, forgotten, but its discovery centuries later proves that it had existed, that these women had found a way to create sacred space even in the heart of an empire devoted to their degradation. If we trace the intellectual genealogy of Assyrian punishment practices forward through time, we see ideas that resurface repeatedly in later empires. The Romans would develop crucifixion partly from Assyrian models of public suffering. Medieval kingdoms would use spectacle and visible punishment in similar ways. Even modern systems of mass incarceration, surveillance, and systemic degradation of certain populations carry forward variations on these themes. The creation of visible examples, the surveillance of the marked population, the transformation of people into warnings. This doesn't mean that we can draw a direct line from ancient Assyrian practices to contemporary injustices. Causality in history isn't that linear. But it does mean that we can recognize patterns, that we can see how certain problems, how to maintain control over populations, how to deal with threats to established order, have recurrent solutions. And by recognizing those patterns, we can perhaps resist them more effectively when we encounter them in our own time. The Assyrian approach to punishment was based on a particular philosophy, that humanity is hierarchical, that some people's existence inherently threatens others, that the solution is transformation and degradation, that public visibility increases the terror. If we encounter these same ideas being applied in contemporary contexts, if we see systems that target people based on their identity, that aim at transforming them into examples, that rely on visibility and surveillance and shame, we might recognize that we're being offered an ancient tool that's been repackaged. The Assyrians are dead. Their empire is dust. But the ideas they systematized never quite died. They mutated, they adapted, they persist. In the deserts of Iraq today, where the ruins of Nineveh and Kalhu still stand, local stories persist. Stories that have been passed down through generations. Stories that Bedouins tell each other about what can be heard at certain times of day when the wind blows at particular angles through the broken columns and buried walls. They say you can hear voices. Scholars have dismissed these as folklore, a psychological projection, the human mind seeking pattern and meaning in the sounds of wind through rubble. But what if we considered an alternative interpretation? What if these stories represent something like cultural memory? What if generations of people living near these ruins have inherited, through some mix of historical transmission and collective intuition, the knowledge that something terrible happened here? That women were broken here? That their suffering was so systematically documented that it left an impression, not just on physical record, but on the land itself? This isn't mysticism. It's phenomenology. It's the idea that trauma, especially systematized trauma, leaves traces. It marks places. And people who live in those places, even generations later, can sense those marks even if they don't have words for what they're sensing. The women who were punished by the Assyrians are dead. They've been dead for 2,500 years. Their bones have decomposed. Most of their names have been permanently erased, exactly as their oppressors intended, but they left other traces. They left clay tablets hidden in rubble. They left their marks on the palace walls as models for artists to carve. They left their stories embedded in the historical record, preserved in the very documents that were meant to celebrate the power of their oppressors, and they left traces in the collective memory of humanity, vague stories, fragmentary records, a sense that something unspeakable happened in ancient Mesopotamia, that empires are capable of horror, that systems of control reach into the depths of human psychology in ways we're still learning to understand. When you study history, really study it, not just memorize dates and rulers' names, but trace the actual experiences of actual people within historical systems, you come face to face with something fundamentally disturbing. You realize that the capacity for sophisticated, systematic, psychologically refined cruelty is not aberrant. It's not exceptional. It's something that empires develop as a normal part of their administrative apparatus. It's something that otherwise intelligent people can come to see as reasonable policy. The Assyrians weren't uniquely evil. They weren't exceptions. They were examples. They were instances of what becomes possible when a political system gains enough power and enough ideological justification to remake people according to its logic. And if we understand this, if we really integrate this into our historical understanding, then we have to ask, what systems do we live in that might be doing something similar? Not with the same methods. Our technologies are different. Our ideologies are different. But using the same underlying logic. The logic that certain people are inherently threatening simply by existing. The logic that their transformation into warnings is justified. The logic that surveillance and visibility can be tools of control. These questions aren't rhetorical. They're invitations to think critically about the systems we participate in and benefit from. The fragments that survive, the clay tablets, the palace records, the skeletal remains, the carved reliefs, they all tell a story that took centuries of scholarship to piece together. And that story is still incomplete. There are gaps, mysteries, things that the historical record simply doesn't contain. But what we can say with confidence is this. Between roughly 911 and 609 BCE, a specific empire engineered a system of suffering that targeted women based on their identity. That system was documented. It was refined. It was treated as an administrative technology worth preserving and transmitting, and it worked. It created terror. It maintained control. And it left traces that are still visible to anyone willing to look at the historical record without turning away. The women who experienced these systems were not passive. Some of them left records. Some of them created shrines. Some of them survived and eventually rebuilt lives, even if those lives were always marked by what they'd endured. Some of them found ways to transform their suffering into meaning, to refuse the narrative that they were worthless, to assert through whatever small acts available to them that they had mattered, that they deserved to exist, that no empire got to decide otherwise. Those voices, those insistences on existence, those refusals to disappear, they echo across 2,600 years. They reach us now. They tell us something about human resilience, but they also tell us something about human capacity for cruelty, about what becomes possible when power is absolute and unchecked, about the importance of remembering these stories, not for comfort, but for warning. Thank you for staying with these stories, for following them into the darkness without looking away. Every person who listens, who engages, who refuses to let these women be forgotten, is participating in a kind of resurrection. You're bringing these voices back from the historical oblivion that was designed for them. If these stories resonate with you, if they disturb you in ways that matter, please subscribe to Quiet Historians. We operate on the principle that history isn't just about what happened in the past. It's about understanding what's possible for human systems. What we've done before, we might do again. Knowing that is crucial. Comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you knew these stories before. Tell me what you think about the choice to document cruelty the way the Assyrians did. What does it mean that empires preserve records of their own worst actions? I genuinely want to know what you're thinking as you process this. And maybe most importantly, tell someone else about this. Share it. Let these women's refusal to disappear completely spread further, because that's how we honour testimony, by passing it on, by refusing the silence that was imposed on these women even now, even after they're dead. The Assyrian Empire is gone. But the challenge it represents remains. How do we build systems that don't rely on the degradation of the marked and the vulnerable? How do we create power structures that don't depend on visible examples of suffering? These questions aren't historical. They're urgent. They're present. They're waiting for us to do better than empires did. Quiet Historians. See you in the next story.